This video is not intended for children. It contains frightening situations that some may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. In the 1980s, a friend of mine lived in a town called Gregory in Michigan. As a teenager, I would occasionally visit him and stay overnight. We were really into paranormal stories and the occult, and I admit we used a Ouija board at his house for a thrill, and even cast some magic circles in the yard when his family was away. The thing is, we knew how to cast the circles, but didn't really know how to banish them, which in retrospect I realized was very risky. After we did these things a bunch of times, just flippantly using a Ouija board or casting magic circles without any real knowledge of what we were doing, paranormal activity started to rise up on his block and quickly increased until it became one of the most haunted places I've ever seen in my life. It started with what we called fairy lights flying around the woods near my friend's property. When we first noticed those, I was pretty stoked. I had always loved fairies, so when I saw those little lights floating around the trees, I thought we should cast more circles so we could encourage more of them to show up. So we did, casting circles basically any chance we got. But pretty soon, we didn't even have to cast the circles. The place became just alive with paranormal activity. Among other less dramatic incidents, my friend and his two little brothers started waking up in the middle of the night with a strange sense of anxiety. On several occasions, when they looked out the window, they saw this tall, white figure standing by the woods. They said the figure had no face, but had long hair that was always blowing in the wind, even if there was no wind. This really freaked out my friend's little brothers. Later, they found out a farmer nearby also saw this thing, which he also described as faceless with white hair that blew in non-existent wind. He even claimed to have shot at it. Apparently, the thing dropped to the ground as if it had been hit, but when the farmer ran up to the spot where the being had been standing, nothing was there. No blood, no nothing. Others in the neighborhood claimed to have seen a similar white entity bounding over briar patches that were 15 feet deep and as high as my head. It just jumped right over them like they were nothing. Of course, after hearing about this ghostly entity, I wanted to see it for myself, so I visited my friend and stayed over with a plan to stay up late in hopes of experiencing a sighting. At about midnight, my friend and I went outside for a cigarette. It was pitch black out, so we brought a pair of flashlights with us. We walked about 30 feet from the house and then stood there talking for a while. We had been out there maybe 10 minutes when we suddenly heard something. It sounded like little kids laughing at us from the forest. I turned my flashlight right on the spot where the voices were coming from, and my flashlight instantly died. So my friend did the same thing, and his flashlight died. The little voices thought this was hilarious and laughed harder at us. They sounded like when you tickle a 3-year-old, but there was no way a bunch of 3-year-olds would be out in pitch dark woods alone after midnight, and in the cold. Not long after, our flashlights suddenly came back on, simultaneously, which was weird in itself. So we shined them back towards the woods where the giggling voices were coming from, and again, they both died. I was so amazed by all this that all I could do was stand there with my mouth open, buzzing with adrenaline. At the same time, the small shed nearby attracted our attention. This shed only held a lawnmower and some yard tools, and there was only one way into the shed, a single door, which we were sure was locked. that door began to shake. We were getting pretty freaked out at this point and started back toward the house. Then we noticed that a fog had risen up, and the house looked like it was 3 times further away than it should have been. All of these things happening at once felt overwhelming, and it was like we couldn't process it all. We rushed back to the house and then just went to sleep, not even really speaking about it. It shocks me today thinking back that we just went to sleep. I'm almost positive if something like this happened to me today, I would be unable to sleep and would probably talk about it for the rest of the night until the sun came up. But no, we just went to sleep. This was the most dramatic thing I'd ever seen in my life. Since then, I've had other experiences in that house. Once, my friend and I heard pounding on the walls that we couldn't explain, and on another occasion, a closet opened up on its own. But none of this other stuff came close to those little tinkling, childlike voices in the dark woods that had total control over our flashlights. My friend and I still talk about that house. We don't like talking about it in front of others outside of our small group of friends, but since social media started, I will talk about it sometimes. I was surprised about how many of the other kids we grew up in that same neighborhood have had similar experiences. Tales of floating lights, and one girl who saw a beach ball-sized orb that she claimed spoke inside her head, as she put it. So it wasn't just us. I still put milk out for the fairies to this day at age 48. Belief in the Fae isn't really a choice for me. My husband, my 4 children, and I were on holiday in Cambridgeshire, England, and were out having a walk in the country along some cornfields. My 7-year-old daughter and I lagged behind whilst the rest of my family were a couple of 100 meters ahead. As we were walking, I noticed what looked like 2 silvery people, no bigger than 10 centimeters, darting about and chasing each other a couple of meters above the corn. They seemed to have a human shape and a circular-shaped blur around them, which I assumed were wings. I pointed them out to my daughter, who said she could see them too. Soon after, they dove into the corn, and my daughter said, "Mom, did you see that? They just flew into the corn." I hadn't said anything, so I knew we had been looking at the same thing. At this point, my eldest daughter had run back to us to see what was taking us so long. We very excitedly explained what we had seen and pointed out to her the spot over the corn where we had seen these flying creatures. That spot appeared to be rippling slightly, like some sort of mirage. We didn't know what to make of the experience. It was something that neither me nor my daughter could explain. I could only guess that the creatures we saw were fairies, as they seemed to be what best fits the description of what we saw. I honestly don't know what to think, although from what I saw, I can only conclude that there are little flying people sharing our world with us, unknown and unnoticed by most. About 3 years ago, I woke early one morning. It must have been around 1 or 2 a.m. It was a hot night, and I had the window open as wide as it would go. Outside, it was dark. We have no streetlights as we're in the country in Essex. I don't recall if there was moonlight or not. I didn't see fairies, but heard clearly a very beautiful tinkling sound that came in waves from the garden outside the window. It sounded a little like wind chimes, but the sound was stranger and more beautiful, clearer with a repetition not found in chimes. Neither ourselves or any of our neighbors have chimes or bells in the garden, and we do not live in a built-up area. I was a little frightened by the sound and was reluctant to go to the window and look out. The sound also had a slightly sinister feeling to it, despite being beautiful. It continued for around 5 minutes before stopping. I listened for the sound many nights after that, as I sleep poorly in the heat, but I didn't hear the sound again. I remain convinced that what I heard was fairy music. My husband and I were having a hike in Cornwall near Morva. We had parked the car and walked to the Menin Tor, then down to the Menskifa, which is a standing stone dating from the early medieval period. We were going back up the track to head up to the Nine Maidens stone circle when the weather began to change. From being a clear sunny day, a strong wind blew up from the west and brought with it a fair deal of cloud and fog. There was a purple-gray hue to this, and we joked about having gone through a portal. At the same time, we saw a man running down the hill, about 20 meters away from where we were standing. When I say run, think of those dreams when the land flies beneath you with each step. He was moving like this over the heathy ground. He stopped and looked at us, and my husband waved. He grinned and waved back, and then continued to run at this incredible pace in an easterly direction until he was out of sight. He was the same sort of height and build as a slim human, just under 6 foot tall with an athletic build. He had shoulder-length hair that was metallic dark gray, like hematite. He wore olive green trousers and a long-sleeved top, but the cut was very unusual, not like anything you would see commonly bought in a shop. It seemed to be made of natural fibers and had a handmade look to it with an odd style. I felt a bit spooked by this appearance, and my husband and I chatted about how strange that man had looked while we reached the top of the hill and the Nine Maidens. We explored the circle for a few minutes and then headed back down. As soon as we stepped out of the circle, the wind died down, the clouds cleared, and it was a bright, sunny day again. While we walked back toward the car, we were talking about the strange events and joked that we hoped the car was still there and that 7 years had not passed. We got to the Menin Tor, and there were 2 women chanting in Cornish at the stones, having left libations there. I can only assume that they were local pagan women or witches performing a rite of some sort. They were happy enough to let us stay for a while before we carried on back to the car. Thankfully, it was still there. Thinking back on the incident, my husband and I agreed that this fellow we saw was probably one of the fair folk that live in a world parallel to our own. This is the strangest thing that has ever happened to me. I probably would have believed I had dreamed the whole thing up had my husband not been there to witness it with me. It has convinced me that there are realms parallel to our own, and I feel really lucky that I was able to witness such a thing. This happened at my friend's house in England, and it happened during the summer. I was about 11 at the time. My best friend, let's just call her Sarah, and I were obsessed with fairies and gnomes. We had these little gnome figurines that we would talk to constantly, and we often played games about going to fairyland. One day, I went to Sarah's house for a sleepover. We decided to make fairy traps, which was a common thing we did, to see if we could catch one. I will point out, though, that the traps were harmless and usually just consisted of an old shoebox filled with shiny items and a bed. We wanted the fairies to fall asleep and stay there until morning. I actually have a video of us making fairy traps on my YouTube channel, which is called Aqua Fairy, if anyone is interested. And I think the video was called something along the lines of Fairy Traps at Sleepover. Anyway, we made the traps as usual, and we left it in her bedroom. We kept the window slightly open so that the fairies could fly in. Then we went to her guest bedroom because we didn't want to sleep in separate rooms. We chatted for a while and talked about how cool it would be to catch or at least see a fairy. Around half an hour later, when we were almost drifting off to sleep, we woke up to hear what I can only describe as jingling bells. They sounded like the type that you would hear on Santa's sleigh. We both turned to each other and gasped in amazement at the thought of a fairy being nearby. The rational part of me was thinking that it could just be someone carrying something that had a bell on it or something like that. But when I peered out the window, no one was there. After a few minutes, the noises stopped along with my joy. Now I couldn't help but feel a little creeped out. Just when we thought it was over, we both saw darting lights outside the window. They were green, orange, red, blue, and gold. Sarah and I watched them in silence for a while, mesmerized. After that, the jingling sounds started again, louder this time, along with the flashing lights that looked like bright, glowing orbs, before finally all the activity stopped. In the morning, a fairy wasn't in the trap, but a few things looked like they had been knocked over. I don't see Sarah much anymore these days, as our lives have taken us in different directions, but I still miss her terribly. I doubt she still believes in fairies, but I do, and I often think about that magical night, where for a few minutes we had an encounter with something neither of us could explain. I was on holiday with my husband in Maui in September 2014. We were doing a morning walk along the boardwalk in Ka'anapali from our oceanfront resort. As we were walking along the boardwalk right next to the ocean, I saw this matte gray fairy or humanoid with wings fly by me. Actually, it almost flew into me. I felt it brush against my chest. I stopped in my tracks and followed its flight path, focusing on its legs, since they looked like human legs but scaled down to a smaller size. In all, it was about the size of my hand, a little bit bigger, about 6 to 8 inches long. It appeared to have 2 wings, and its legs were dangling and bent at the knee. Its feet looked like doll feet with no toes, and it looked like it had gray stockings on. I heard no music, but the wings made a flying or flapping noise. It flew into some nearby bushes, and I followed it quickly and spotted it, seemingly hiding and possibly doing something else, maybe opening a secret door or something like that, because a second later, it was gone. The whole experience couldn't have lasted more than 10 seconds, even though time seemed to stand still as I was watching this thing. My husband did not see the creature, but he saw my reaction of total disbelief at what I had witnessed. I have seen a lot of weird things in my life, but never did I imagine I would see a mythical creature like a fairy. I felt it wanted to be seen by me, though I might have just been lucky. The Hawaiian Islands are said to be a place of mystical things, and the Menahunes are known on the island as the small people that like to play tricks. It was an incredible experience that I will never, ever forget. I was driving through a small village near Hale in Cornwall. It was a windy autumn night, little traffic on the road, and I was driving quite slowly near a crossroad that had some street lighting. As I drove, I became aware of movement coming towards me with the wind. At first, I didn't know what I was seeing as everything had a distorted, foggy look to it. But eventually, things came into focus, and I saw people moving with the wind. Carts as well, and a small horse, only a little larger than a Labrador dog. The horse was a pale sort of electric blue, and there was white in its mane. As it cantered past, it looked directly at me. It was followed by other creatures, possibly humanoid, though something was stopping me from focusing properly on them. But I had the strong impression that they were fairies, traveling on the wind behind that horse, though I saw no details. At this point, something passed between me and the horse, and I had the strong impression that that something was reading my state of mind, or possibly influencing it. I became aware that I was completely unafraid, and thought about how odd that was, given the situation was so unusual. Odder still, I realized I was full of joy and not surprised by what I was seeing. Surprise came later when I reflected on what I had undoubtedly seen. Soon the horse and the others seemed to melt away on the wind. Before this experience, I had previously had an interest in fairy folklore, and when I was teaching in Wales, one of my intelligent sixth formers told me that several members of her family had seen Tylwyth, as they are known in Welsh, near a mound in one of the fields of the family farm. The reason I mention this is to express that at the time of seeing the fairy horse, I was and remain predisposed to believe rather than doubt. I believed in the existence of other dimensions of reality normally not perceivable by humans, and I believe that what we call fairies exist, and that they are non-malignant beings, dangerous only if treated with disrespect. I was traveling for a week in Ireland. I had already visited ancient sacred sites like Newgrange and the Hill of Tara. I even had the experience of joining in a seance with some hippies at the Hill of Tara. Nothing interesting happened. That is, until I went camping in Portrush, Northern Ireland. I was hoping to camp out in one of the caves near the Giant's Causeway, but I had no luck in getting there after arriving late in the night. I heard from one of the locals that the grassy dunes next to the beach weren't a bad spot to pitch a tent for the night. So that evening I found the dunes and a nice grassy little glen that offered respite from the wind if kneeling. My tent was just low enough that it didn't make too terrible a noise as the wind blew over its peak. I just received my brand new phone a week prior and wanted to see if it might capture the glory of my little campsite on the backdrop of the sea. So I sat behind the tent, laid back out of the path of the wind, and took a shot. I was wearing my headlamp, and it illuminated the picture with a slightly yellow hue. I immediately noticed something odd about the picture, though. Directly above my tent was a small greenish gold light. I tried to spot it with my headlamp with no success. Looking this way and that, I saw nothing, so I turned off my lamp, and yet there was still no sign of what had caused this light, nor was there any ship in the distance. This all happened in about the span of several seconds. I knew it couldn't be an insect of any sort, for the wind was too strong, and I should have been able to catch it in the beam of my lamp. The only logical thing to do was to check if it would show up in more pictures, and it did. I couldn't see it with the naked eye, but the light was moving this way and that, above and around my tent, it seemed. I kept taking pictures until it appeared to leave, and the rest of the images were empty of the mysterious light. Perplexed as to what I had seen, the only thing I could do next was get some rest for the next day. Before I went to bed, I set my phone, which was brand new, on my backpack, only to wake the next morning to find it in the exact same spot, but with a hard fracturing impact to the top center. I couldn't believe it. I was furious. I insist that the phone was in absolute prime condition when I set it down. I had taken no falls or made accidental drops that night or the entire trip. It was set up in a grass glen. No stones, not even sticks, only sand below. There was no evidence left behind as to what could have possibly done this. The damage was fresh, as there were small fragments of glass across its surface. I guess I must have upset this fairy, will-o'-the-wisp. What? You tell me. I'm just here left with a story that, well, only this audience might believe. It was a nice glen, that is certain. Maybe I disrespected this being's space that night, and cracking my phone was its way of letting me know. I guess I should count myself lucky. From everything I've read about disrespecting the fairies, it could have been a whole lot worse. Thanks for watching. As always, extra special thanks goes out to all my supporters on Patreon. Thank you guys so much for the support you continually give this work. I just really appreciate it, and it's hugely motivating for me to continue the work that I do. If you like this content and you would like to support it, please check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description. Even $1 is really appreciated and really goes a long way to help. Other ways you can help the channel are just by sharing this video, liking, and commenting below. That's also really helpful, and I appreciate it. Also, make sure to hit the bell to receive notifications of new videos. Some people mentioned after I posted my last video that they hadn't received a notification even though they had hit the bell, which is really strange, but I noticed that it's a complaint that seemingly a lot of independent creators on YouTube are having. So I'm not sure if there's some kind of glitch going on, or I don't know because YouTube, they don't seem to be recommending my channel as much anymore, or a lot of independent creators. So I'm not sure what's going on with them. But either way, it might be better to follow me on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, because I tend to also post notifications there for my new videos. If you really want to see them, that way you won't miss out. Also, just if you want to help out the channel, please do share it on other social media sites, because as I'm saying, I don't know, YouTube, they don't seem to want to recommend independent creators anymore. I hope they'll change, but right now, I don't know what's going on. Okay, back to business. The stories in this video came courtesy of subscribers and the fairy census. I want to thank everyone who submitted. Some of these stories from the census were edited to make them more friendly for narration, but if you want to read the originals, the link to the census is in the description. Let me know what you thought about this one in the comments, and I will be in the comments answering questions or answering your comments for the next hour or so. So I look forward to chatting with you guys. I'm always collecting your true fairy encounter stories, so definitely send me one if you've got one. I'd love to read it. My email is in the description. The same goes for fairy art, or really anything fairy related, fairy photography, fairy music, anything that you like to share, I would like to see it. All right. Thanks for tuning in for this one, and until next time, this has been a visit from your scary Fairy, Godmother.